forms. Jerry Williams will be doing that. We'll take a mid-afternoon break, and so I'll turn it over to Jerry.
Okay. All right. I'd like to welcome everyone back from lunch. Before we get started with the forms and the registration, I would like to take this opportunity to answer some questions that we received through the email account on the morning presentations. So we'll do that real quickly, and then we'll get started on the forms. We received a question that says, what is the reason we cannot install equipment and put flanges on it so it cannot physically be placed in service? This would allow companies to speed the construction process. Well, the reason you can't do that is because Rule 13 is very clear on what can and can't be done. And it states that placing the mission unit in service is not allowable. So that's the answer to that question. Another question. Is what is the definition of the initial flowback stage and when the separation flowback stage starts? And those definitions were set forth in the most recent version of subpart 4.0, and let me find those definitions for you and read that. The initial flowback stage is the period during a well completion operation which begins at the onset of flowback and ends at the separation flowback stage. The definition of separation flowback stage is the period during a well completion operation when it is technically feasible for a separator to function. The separation flowback stage ends either at the startup of production or when the well is shut in and permanently disconnected from the flowback equipment. A question. Can you go into detail on the requirements of the 6 tons per year tank rule? Looking back at what we went over earlier, subpart 4.0 states that if your tank has emissions that are 6 tons or greater of VOC, then you're required to reduce the VOC emissions from those tanks by 95%. Furthermore, it goes into requirements on those control devices that have to be utilized for that. If they're below 6 tons per year, either by potential or by the utilization of a control device that you have in a federally enforceable document, then you would be subject to Section 6 and 8 of the general permit versus Section 7. A question. When are we required to use G80-A? Will it start after the comment period of March 30, 2015? Will the G70-A still be good during the comment period? You will be required to use General Permit G80-A once it is issued. The comment period does end on March 30th, 2015. However, it will not be issued on April 1st, 2015. There is a lot that goes into issuing a general permit. If we receive comments, there's no prediction of what kind of comments we receive or the volume of comments. We will also be having a public meeting on March 16th. And from there, we may be able to gauge from that the interest of comments or none and have a better predictor at that time. But there is no way for us to say that April 1st or April 15th or May 1st that this thing will be issued, because until we see what comments that we will receive and how we are going to address those, there's no way to make that prediction. Currently, you can still apply for the G30, 35, or 70, and like I stated earlier, if there's a situation where the G80 is issued and you have an application in for one of those, the reviewing engineer will work with the company in making sure that we get the appropriate information to issue any new registration under the G80 once it's issued rather than the G30, 35, or 70. but I just want to reiterate that you can still apply today up until it's issued for those permits, and then we'll just transition over once the G80 is issued. The other question, if you already have a permit application in-house at DEP for one of the other general permits, will those permits be finalized? What is the cutoff deadline of applications submitted? The answer to that question is the same as the previous. And those were the questions that we received this morning through the DEP G80 email account. So with that being said, I'm going to start the presentation on the application document. On the back table, I provided copies of the application document and the proposed registration for this general permit. So if you did not pick one of those up, they're in the back. So with the G80 registration application, we're going to ask what type of registration of those that you're applying for. We're going to ask for general information about your facility. We're going to ask that the responsible official certifies that information. We'll ask about operating site information, and then any attachments or supporting documents that are going to be part of it. Where I'd like to direct your attention to now is page 1 of the general permit application. I know it's very difficult to see this on the screen. That's why I provided paper copies so you could follow along. Anyone familiar with the general permitting process realizes that we've got one application. You pick which of the 6 general permits it applies to, and then each one of those have different attachments. It's confusing to applicants. It's confusing to us sometimes. And why was it done like that? I mean, we had to start somewhere, and so that's the way it started, and it just kind of got carried forward over the years. But we made the decision that we need to tailor this to the particular type of industry type that it's going to be applying for these. So we decided that you're not going to, when you submit your G80 application, these are the forms that you're going to use. You're not going to use the general permit forms that exist in their current format. And like Bev said earlier, our goal is to redo all those general permits and get those up to date and update all of the application forms that associate with those. And so that means our goal would be to follow a similar format with those that we have here. So you're going to go through and you're going to decide, you're going to pick the type of application you're going to apply for, fill in information about your facility. We, in the past, had asked for UTMs. We're going to latitude and longitude, so you need to be sure that you use that. And as far as, once again, everyone's seen the whole responsible official certification, and to complete that. There is a type of source. You're either going to be a production facility, compressor facility, or dehydration facility, so you need to make that choice whenever you apply for the registration. On page 2 of the application, we want you to briefly describe the change or the new things or changes you're going to have at the facility, and we want you to provide directions to the facility. And please be specific in your directions. Not only are those directions utilized by us, by the people reviewing the application to be able to see exactly where this is, it's utilized by enforcement so that they can find these places to inspect, and it's utilized by the general public because they have a right to know what's going on around them. So we went over the fees earlier, so you have to include a check. We also give you the option here, I wish to pay by electronic transfer or by credit card. So if you're not going to enclose the check, please mark the appropriate box. And then also mark the appropriate box for your fees. And as you can see, I footnoted that by saying if you're subject to 4J and 4O and 4I, you don't have to pay 3 NSPS fees, you just have to pay 1 NSPS fee. And once again, same thing with the NESHAP. If you're Existing 4Z and double H, just pay one NESHAP fee, not two. But if you're new 4Z, you don't pay the NESHAP fee, you pay the NSPS fee because you'd be subject to 4-hour 4J. So everything below there are check boxes for things that you may be subject to in the permit. And rather than go through them here individually, I'm going to go through them one by one following the slide. I don't want to say this and then have to repeat the same thing over. So all these attachments may not apply to you, but if they do apply, it is necessary that you check the appropriate box. And before I go any further, when Bev had talked earlier about this will be the DAQ's first attempt at e-permitting whenever that may happen, the people that are going to make, the computer people that are going to make e-permitting happen, which is not me, but they're going to want to meet with us and say which one of the, what blanks on this form must be filled out in order for this, for you guys to accept this application. So we're going to meet with them and we're going to make determinations like what needs to be filled out, what's optional, what's mandatory. And so like if you go to submit an application and you have an engine and you decide like I'm not going to write the horsepower down, well, the system won't accept, you go to submit the application, the system will not accept it. So it's going to be set up that if it's missing something that is required in order for us to accept that application, it will not accept it. So just keep that in mind that like if we get to that point, and I know there's probably going to be some growing pains, but if it gets to that point and it gets kicked back and it says, you know, we're not going to accept this application unless you put down the make and model of the engine, then, you know, that's the way it's going to be if you want to do the permitting. But it's going to be the way it is if you apply by paper too, because if you say, well, we're going to have an engine, but we don't know what it is. Well, if you don't know what it is, how can you predict your emissions? So, I mean, we're not going to be unrealistic about it. We understand that there are some instances where you might not know certain things. So that's why I'm saying we're going to go through these things line by line when we meet those people to make sure that we get the information that we need. So the first attachment we're going to talk about is single source determination. And that, for no better term, aggregation. And like, it seems like a dirty word to everyone because I think there is a misconception on what that is when people say aggregation. And like Bev talked about earlier, everybody thinks it means different things. But Bev went through the three-prong test on how you make a single source determination. And I wish it was as easy as her one slide made it out to be, but it's really not. And also, sometimes, you know, it's different sides. I mean, sometimes people don't think we aggregate anything, and then other times people think that's all we want to do is aggregate everything. And neither one of those statements are true. What our goal is to make the appropriate determination. We're not saying we want to aggregate everything or we don't want to aggregate anything. If I'm reviewing something, I want to make sure that I make an educated decision on whether or not this qualifies as a single source. And, you know, sometimes, I mean, I know this, you know, when I ask questions as a company, I get attitude as if like I'm trying to say, well, I'm going to aggregate. And that's not what's going on. What's going on is I'm trying to get as much information as I can so I make the correct decision. Not just I mean other people in our section as well. That is the goal. And we've seen, you know, some people do a really good job in their aggregation statements that they send to us, and others don't. And sometimes people maybe misunderstand what it is that we're looking for. So what we did is we took the guesswork out of it, in our opinion, and instead of you telling us what it is that it's going to, you know, how it's going to be, we developed a form to ask a series of questions. And from that series of questions, it'll be up to the reviewing engineer to make a decision based on the answers to those questions. But we're still going back and looking at the core principles, which is common control, contiguous or adjacent, or same industrial grouping. And if you turn your attention to page 3 of the application, you'll see the series of questions that we've asked. I understand that we're going to get feedback on this, and we welcome the feedback. We want to see what you guys think about it, not only industry but the general public, to see how you guys feel about the question we're asking. And like I said, we'll take that information that we get, and we can make a decision based on these items. But as Bev also talked about earlier, we look at this every single time. We ask, we look at this. If we have questions, we ask you guys the questions and make the decision. And as she stated, it's not like we have 600 aggregation decisions. So it's not something that is a common phenomenon. The biggest problems with aggregation that we've ran into is when you co-located sources. That's where you're going to get a lot of feedback from us when trying to make the decision on whether to aggregate. Common or co-located sources creates the biggest amount of friction in trying to make that determination whether or not to aggregate a source. The next attachment B, is a siting criteria waiver. When I talked about earlier, there's a siting criteria. The general permit is 300 feet from the dwelling, business, church, park, and other things that we talked about earlier. If you are going to locate a facility that's in 300 feet of a dwelling or a business, and when I say facility, I want to be clear, I want to say an emission unit. So, say you own 10 acres of property, and you're setting your emission unit in the center. You need to measure your 300 feet, or we're going to measure your 300 feet from the emission unit. We're not going to measure 300 feet from your fence line. However, when let's say we make a decision today that you met the siting criteria, and then you go to install something next year, and you install it out near your fence line, and somebody built a house out by your fence line, well, you're not going to be eligible at that point in time. So you need to look at it, say, okay, 300 feet from here. So it's 300 feet from the emission unit to the dwelling or business. It's not 300 feet from your fence line to 300 feet to the other person's fence line. It's emission unit to the dwelling, business, etc. So if you can't meet that, and you can have the option, and it's basically a notarized statement that you get notarized that the property owner waives the siting criteria. Next thing is we require a current business certificate. If you're a West Virginia business, then you get a business registration certificate from the Secretary of State's office. That's all you want, which looks like that. That is what we're looking for when we ask for that from the Secretary of State's office. If it's a non-West Virginia business, you have the copy of the Certificate of Authority. If you're a new business, we need you to send us a copy of the application that you've sent into the Secretary of State's office to become a registered business. And anytime we get an application, during the review, one of the things that we look at is whether or not you're in default with unemployment or workers' comp. If you are in default of unemployment or workers' comp, we cannot issue a permit or registration to you. and that's in Title 96 Series 1 state rule. So we do check those things. If you're in default, you'll get a phone call that says, we can't issue this until you get this straightened out. We'll ask for a process flow diagram, which is something that it's a drawing that will supplement the process description. You need to show all sources at your facility, and it needs to be understandable from start to finish, and with everything in between. All emission units, all air pollution control devices, emission reduction devices, and all the emission units or emission point IDs that are represented on the drawing must match what is in the application with the emission units table. Those must match. If you're doing a modification, you need to clearly identify the areas of that drawing that are being modified. A process description is a detailed narrative of what's going on. If you're installing a natural gas compressor station, don't write installing a natural gas compressor station. I mean, it needs to follow the process from beginning to end. I may know what that is, coworkers may know what that is, but general public may have no idea what that is. So, and when I say I may know what it is, maybe I do, maybe I don't. I mean, unless you list everything that's going on, I mean, I don't want to make an assumption. So you need to be clear on what and it has to be in logical order. You need to include all the emission units, like I said, from beginning to end. And anything else that you feel is pertinent to understand the process, please include that as well. We'll need a plot plan. Please submit a scaled and detailed plot plan of your facility, where all the emission units are located, air pollution control devices are located, how you get to it off of a main road, where the building entrances and exits are, height of stacks or buildings, things of that nature. Please list, try to be where the fence lines are going to be. That's very helpful in the fact that, like, we get a call from a public citizen who says, how far is this away from the fence line, or, how far is my house from the fence line? Well, if that information is not provided, I really can't clearly answer that question without, calling whomever to find that out. So please include that with your application. And plot plans are required for all applications. We're also requiring an area map, which is going to indicate the current or proposed location of the facility or modification. Once again, include the property lines, access roads, if there are dwellings or businesses nearby that are going to be close to that 300-foot siting criteria, those need to be included. And we also are asking that you draw a 300-foot boundary circle around those emission units. And that'll show that'll be the starting point from what we're trying to make a determination of the siting criteria. We do double check the siting criteria. So don't think that it's not 300 feet. We send people out and look at this, and you don't know how many times that we'll have to call and question the location of certain things because we were told that it wasn't an issue when it really was. So now I'm going to get into the detailed portion of the application and the forms. This general permit allows you to register a lot of different types of emission units and control devices. It does contain 15 sections, and like I said earlier, every source would be subject to sections 1 through 4. And like I said earlier, this permit allows you to apply for the sections that you'd like to register under. And if after review of the application we determine that all the requirements are met, a registration will be issued to the company, and it will state the sections that are applicable in the registration form. So if you turn to page 10 of your registration application, you will see what we're calling attachment 8, which is a section applicability form, which allows you the ability to determine which sections that you would like to apply for. And as you will see at the bottom of that page, it reminds you that if you're subject to a certain section, you're either subject to another section or you may be subject to another section. So you need to take that into account. Like if you have a storage vessel subject to section 6, you may be also subject to section 7 if it's subject to the Quad O control requirements, or you may be subject to section 8 if you have a control device and it's not subject to the Quad O requirements. So as you can see, there's different scenarios below where if you're subject to one section, you may be subject to another section, or you are subject to another section. And please fill this out. I mean, you would be surprised at the number of applications we get for these that people don't fill this out. And so I really don't know why they applied for the application if they're not telling us what they want to be registered under. So you need to make sure that you fill those sections out, because we can't guess what it is that you're trying to do. So attachment I talks about the emission units or emission reduction devices that and air pollution control devices that you are going to have at your facility. I want to be clear that you need to include all of your storage vessel information. When you look at the storage vessel section, essentially what it's dealing with is dealing with storage vessels that are going to condensate or produce water, things that are going to have measurable VOC emissions. It's not going to cover your used oil storage tanks or your TG tanks, things that like have no measurable emissions to speak of. However, you must list all of your storage vessels on this emission unit data sheet. So if you have a 1,000-gallon used oil tank, indicate on the emission unit data sheet that you have a 1,000-gallon used oil tank. If you have a 2,000-gallon TEG tank, list it. When our inspectors go out in the field and look at these places and they see equipment on the ground that's not in the permit, there's questions. And, are they allowed to have this? They give us a call. Can they have this? Can they do this? Whatever. So you must include all that information so that way it's clear. We're not going to set an emission limit on a 1,000-gallon used oil tank. We're not going to set a throughput limit on a 1,000-gallon used oil tank. We understand the emissions associated with those, but they must be included with your application. So as you can see on this form, we're asking you to identify the emission unit and emission point ID number with the specific emission unit, whether it be an engine, DHI, heater treater, whatever it may be. The year that it was installed or modified, the manufacture date. This is going to prove, this is going to be necessary for taking into account engines and tanks and things of that nature. What the design capacity is. Is it 1,000 horsepower? Is it 20,000 gallons? What size is it? It couldn't be 20,000 gallons because it'd be KB. But the type and date of the change, if you're looking at is it new as a modification? Are you removing something? Is there a control device associated with it? Like if you had an engine and you had NSCR, you would put that in the control device. Or like, are you going to utilize an emission reduction device? Like, is it going back to flame zone of the reboiler if it's a D-high? Like, whatever it may be, all that needs to be indicated on this particular form. And if you have more emission units than what fits on this form, just use multiple forms. But that form is in Word, so you should just be able to tab one down and just create as many lines as you like. The next thing is that we're asking for a fugitive emission summary. And we ask that you include all sources of fugitive emissions. Loading operations, equipment leaks, blowdown emissions. And those will be represented on page 12 of the application under attachment J, where you'll see component type, pumps, valves, safety relief valves, so forth and so on, closed vent system, yes or no, the count of those components, how often it's being monitored, the average time of repair in days, the source of the leak factor it was utilized, the stream type, and the estimated emissions for each one of those. And which leak detection method was utilized when you go to check for leaks. Was it AVO, was it FLIR camera, other, and describe that in the space for description. And then down below, it asks for an explanation of the sources of fugitives, like once again, pigging, equipment blowdowns, pneumatics, etc. Are there any closed vent bypasses? If so, where? And list those. And any equipment that's used in that closed vent system also needs to be listed on that form. On the following page, on page 13, is a summary of page 12, where you'll indicate the hourly and annual PT of the pollutants and the calculation methodology that was used. Okay, so now we're going to get into start talking about the pieces of equipment that are going to be involved in this and what's covered in this permit. As far as like we have a gas well data sheet, and it needs to be completed for the natural gas or the gas well effective facilities under Quad O, which are those that are after August 23rd, 2011. What we're asking you to do, if you look at page 14, is include the API number of the well. If there is no API number because it's a planned well, indicate that it's a planned well, planned. The farm name that's associated with the well, the date of the flowback, the date of the well completion, and whether or not it's a green completion and or a combustion device that's being utilized. If you're not familiar with what an API number is, which I'm sure all that you are, there's an example down below that indicates what the format is. Like the 47 stands for the state code for West Virginia, and the county code, like 1 is Barber County, and then 1 it would be the first well in Barber County, and so forth and so on. And we do track those in our database, and that is linked to oil and gas, correct, Robert? The API numbers. Linked to oil and gas website as well? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Like I said this morning, with the storage vessel section being probably the largest section of the G80 general permit, as far as types of air pollution control devices that can be utilized or types of emission reduction devices that could be utilized, and everything that goes along with that. Filling out the storage vessel data sheet is also the most onerous of all the forms that we're utilizing. When we develop these forms, like, some of these forms have existed, and some of them, over time, like, well, maybe we could do this, or maybe we don't want to ask for this, trying to, like, make them the best that we can. So I looked at the old forms that we had utilized, and then looked at, from feedback from coworkers, feedback from enforcement, feedback from the public and industry, and try to develop a form that not only for storage vessels, for all their sources, that we felt covered what we needed. During the public comment period, obviously, if you have concerns or questions about any of the forms or things that, like, can be done better or not good enough, please let us know. So that way, any changes that we make to the forms prior to will be done based on, information from the public and from industry. The storage vessel data sheet, it says, must be completed for all storage vessels. But before you jump the gun, and I know some of you've probably looked ahead at some of these forms, we don't want the first 3 or 4 pages of that form for used oil tanks or TG tanks and things of that nature. Those we want you to list on page 18 of the registration application, which is just going to ask you for the content of the tank and the volume. So, like, de minimis tanks, such as used oil tanks, things of that nature, those are the forms that we're asking you to fill out for them. The forms on pages 15 through 17 will be your produced water tanks and your condensate tanks. That's the information we're asking for those. If you have 5 400-barrel condensate tanks and all the throughputs are the same and all of your information about the tanks are the same, you don't need to fill the form out 5 times. Just fill it out once and say TK1 through TK5 or whatever nomenclature that you're going to use for your tanks. It's not necessary. You guys don't want to fill it out 5 times more than any time than we want to have to, like, go through it 5 times because it's the same data. With these forms, you need to include the gas sample analysis that you used when you did your flashing calculation emissions, whether you used ProMax or EMP tanks or HISIS or whatever you utilized. You need to include the gas sample that you used in making that determination. You also need to include the not just the output of whatever calculation methodology you use, but also any of the input values. So I'm not saying this happens, but I mean, we need to know that what you put in equals what you put out, and not just if we don't have anything to verify it with, it's just random at that time. So we need the inputs and the outputs and the gas sample analysis so that it all matches up. So if we turn to page 15 of the registration application, I said if you have like a condensate tank or a produced water tank, then you need to fill this out, and it's going to indicate what your emission unit emission point ID is that will match up with the attachment I, and ask for dates, ask for types of change. I'm not going to go through and read every one of these sections, but I ask that you take this information with you, you read it, you familiarize yourself with it. Whatever comments you may have, it's not going to hurt our feelings. Make the comments that you feel are necessary, and then, once we get all the comments, we'll make decisions at that time. Are we making changes? Are we not making changes? Are we modifying it? But rather than me going through and reading everything, which is unnecessary, like I talked about earlier, though, I talked this morning about how you make the determination, your emissions determination, as far as the methodology used and your timelines for doing so. That stays true. So you just go through and you'll answer these questions on this form about the tank. You'll have tank information over down below. It'll ask about the different dimensions of the tank, the capacity of the tank, what type of tank that it is. And then on page 16, it talks about, are there any emission control devices associated with the tank? Include what your expected emission rate of the tank is and your emission method used. And then down below, it talks about tank construction and operation information, and all that needs to be completed. And same thing carries over onto page 17. But then it gets to asking information about the site, where it's located, average temperatures, wind speed, atmospheric pressure, things of that nature. And then finishes up with asking information about the liquids that are stored in a storage vessel. For example, temperatures, pressures, the density, molecular weight, things of that nature. And those, they have to match, your sample. I mean, don't give us a sample one thing and then write something else down, do your calculations on something else. And that has happened, where I've got applications where the pressure and temperature are nowhere near how they did the calculations versus reality. So double check that all those things match up. And like I said, on page 18 is where you need to list the information on the tanks, the other tanks that are going to be at the facility. Okay. Next sheet is the natural gas fired fuel burning unit data sheet. And that's going to be for all your gas production units at your facility, your heaters, inline heaters, but not your reboilers. Reboilers are covered under the same section as the GPUs, heaters, and line heaters in the permit in section 9, but we ask that you input the information on the reboiler on the DHI sheet, which we'll get to here later. And a reminder that the maximum design heat input of any of these units cannot exceed, or must have to be less than 10 million BTU per hour. Shouldn't be a problem because, like I said, most of them we see are in the 0.5 to 1.5 range. So if you turn to page 19 of your application, it's a sheet where you have to fill out for the natural gas fired fuel burning unit. And you'll include the IDs, the description, year modified, the maximum design heat input, and the fuel heating value. And after this presentation, like I said, I will be going over the registration, and at that point in time, you'll see on the registration the type of information that we'll be placing there, so you'll see what it is that your requirements are. So then we're moving on to internal combustion engine data sheet. And this has to be completed for each engine that you have at your facility. You need to include manufacturer's data sheets and also any type of air pollution control device data sheet. If you have a catalyst and You got a sheet from Emit Technologies that says what your reduction is by the use of the catalyst. That needs to be included along with the manufacturers. Like you got a Caterpillar engine, you need to include both forms or both data sheets with the application. So that way that we can verify that the numbers that you guys have calculated are what is reality. This is a form that most of you are familiar with, but we did modify it so that it would fit this general permit. We're still asking for information on the emission unit ID, manufacturer and model, what the capacity of the engine is. We're asking for manufacturer date, obviously, to make determinations for Quad I, Quad J, and Quad O. And then we're asking you guys to, which will all be verified, is it a 4J engine? Yes, no. If it is it a certified 4J engine? Because that's necessary in the fact that, like, if it is a certified engine, either 2.4i or 4J, you must include the EPA certificate of conformity, which matches up with the engine that you are proposing. We do not accept, like if the manufacturer gives you something that says it's 4J compliant, we're not going to take that. We need the EPA certificate of conformity, and it has like the little EPA seal at the top, and it'll go through and it'll talk about like the concentrations of what it was certified to. That's what has to be utilized in order for to be deemed a certified engine. So you got 4i and 4J, are they certified? Then is it a 4Z engine? If it's 4Z new, then you meet the 4J requirements. And then also, is it in that window of time for 4Z and 4J where there's really no standard per either rule? And there's I can't remember the dates off the top of my head, but there's a brief period of time where it's not subject to either. And some of you guys have submitted that, and that's fine, but you need to mark that box and provide an explanation that it does fall within that window. So then it's just more typical information we've asked about before. Is it rich burn 4-stroke, lean burn 4-stroke, 2-stroke? All that needs to be indicated there. Whatever air pollution control device is associated with it. What are you burning? Is it diesel? Is it natural gas? We need your throughputs. Once again, you can't do a synthetic miner, so you need to make sure that you can't take a smaller annual limit than hourly limit unless it's an emergency generator. Emergency generator, you must calculate your annual emissions on 500 hours per year. And you'll see there's cubic feet per hour, gallons per hour, and that's just going to be whether it's natural gas or diesel. Also, you want to indicate is the fuel usage or the hours of operation metered, yes or no? And then you indicate what your emissions are and your calculation methodology. When you calculate your emissions, you need to use manufacturer's data. So please utilize manufacturer's data when you do your engine calculations. On page 22 of the registration application is the air pollution control device sheet for the engine. You need to include, if you have one, you need to include the catalyst manufacturer sheet to show what the reduction is for the pollutants in question. You need to indicate what type of control device that it is and provide all the data that's asked for on that sheet. At the bottom of that sheet, it asks about performance testing. this will all be verified by us, but it's a reminder to you guys that, performance testing, you need to look into this. You need to think before you get this permit. Is it required? Was it required as an initial? Is it an initial and annual? Is it just field testing? So you need to think about those things. When you have an engine and you're applying for a permit, you need to think about, okay, we need to test this. How often do we need to test it? And that'll all be spelled out in the registration when we issue the registration back to you guys. Okay, tanker truck loading. This was something that came about when, going back to 2008, when we did G30 and G35, it was an afterthought. I mean, like, it's not like it is today. You might have a truck come out every month or every 2 months and load, and that's that, but that's not the case anymore with the amount of liquids that are being encountered. And so the 30 and 35 didn't provide a vehicle for you to get a registration under a general permit if you had truck load out, because there were no requirements in those documents to accommodate it. So a lot of people were forced to go the route of the Rule 13 construction permit in order to accommodate those situations. So we're proposing in the G80 to cover that, and that document can be found on page 23, and go through. And once again, as I talked about it this morning, it talks about if you have a closed system, it talks about the control efficiencies or the capture efficiencies that can be utilized. Once again, if you choose to go the route of the NSPS or MAC level tank trucks, then you'll need to have proof that is really what happened. So we issue a permit or registration, and we say it's got to be NSPS level tested, and then an inspector comes out and says, I need to see all the records where this truck met these standards. You need to make sure that you have those records. And go through, and it just, we'll ask for the types of liquids that are loaded, the number of pumps that you have, how many trucks are you going to be having loaded at one time. Talk about cleaning location. Are they pressure tested? Your operating schedule of your loadout. And then, like, what kind of liquids are you going to be loading there? Is it going to be condensate and produced water, or just one or the other? What your throughput is on a daily basis, what your throughput is on an annual basis, and loading method utilized. And when you do the calculations for the truck loadout, which you're going to do using the AP42 emission factors, you need to make sure that if it's submerged fuel, that the value that you utilize for submerged fuel is the number that's used in your calculations. And you need to make sure that the molecular weight and the temperatures of your fluids match what's on the sample. So you need to make sure that all these things match up, because we do check that. We make sure that, like, the molecular weight and of the fluid and the temperature and pressure, all that stuff matches up, and that you did the calculations appropriately. And so you got to, if you have that, if you're going to take that capture efficiency, and then say, let's also you're going to have like a control device, carbon absorption or flare or whatever it is that you may utilize, then you're going to apply that control device efficiency to the capture efficiency. So the example this morning, if it was 70% capture and 98 control, you'd look at that 69% overall reduction. And that form carries over onto page 24. That at that point in time, that's where you'll indicate what your maximum VOC and HAP emissions are. And you need to provide both. More than 50% of the time, we're told there are no HAPs. And then, so we have to push the issue and ask them what the HAP emissions are. I know sometimes they may be minuscule, and maybe, I'm not trying to say that anybody thinks they don't matter, but we need, you need to indicate what those values are. And hopefully, if we go to e-permitting, and one of those things are, we're going to have the emission values will definitely be mandatory. So if you don't fill those values in, and it won't accept your application. I mean, when it's on paper copies, we'll have to call and say, what are they if they're not included. But if we go to e-permitting, hopefully one of the mandatory values will definitely be emissions. So that way, they can't be emitted. Attachment P deals with the glycol dehydration units, and that has to be included for all new or modified dehy units, reboilers, flash tanks. If we got a regenerator, all those things need to be included. And you need to include a gas sample, and you need to include your glycalc, and you need to include the input and the aggregate. Once again, I think you'd be shocked at the number of times we find that some of the values don't match up. Either the gas sample doesn't match the inputs that were placed in the glycalc, or sometimes we don't even get the input numbers at all. So we need to get the input numbers so we can verify that they match. And believe it or not, there are instances where we get the input and the aggregate report, and even when you put the inputs in, they don't match the aggregate report. And so we have to question that. So please submit the gas sample. Please submit the input, because we will verify that the aggregate report matches reality. So on page 25 of the application is the data sheet for the dehy units. And we asked for the basic information we asked for before, manufacturer model, what the flow rate of the gas is, the heat input of the reboiler, when it was installed, modified, any air pollution control device or emission reduction device associated with it, throughput, water content, and then we get into exemption language as far as throughput goes, or benzene exemptions. We ask those questions, and you provide that information. And then you need to include what the emissions are for the unit, for the reboiler vent, for the steel vent, for the flash tank. And once again, you need to make sure that those values match up with your glycalc analysis. It has historically, because of a variation of gas sampling analysis over time, we have in the past allowed for a 20% variable of the gas sample, like when you do your if you did your glycalc emissions, and I'll just use one example because that's easy math, and you had 1 ton a year of VOC emissions in the steel vent, that we would permit the dehy unit at 1.2 to account for gas variability. That way, we know that it varies over time. So if you're 1 today, you might be 1.01 tomorrow. Or if you're 1.01 tomorrow, then you're out of compliance with your registration. So historically, we have allowed a factor of 20% to be applied towards the VOC and like your HAPs, like your BTECs. So like you could increase the VOC and the BTECs by 20% to account for the gas variability of the dehy. And I don't think that I was clear on that in the application or the fact sheet. So most likely whenever, well, I mean, we'll have additional comments, and there'll be changes that are made to these documents, but I'll make sure that, we clarify that in the fact sheet and the document so that everybody, knows that that is an allowable circumstance. On page 26 of the application, we ask for information, for any flash tank and or generator information that you may have. Once again, make and model, the capacity, what the contents are, any type of controls, the control efficiency, pressures, temperatures, all that information has to be included. You need to include the calculation methodology that was utilized in making that determination, and include those calculations on this page. So now we're going to talk about pneumatic controllers. And it's going to go back to, it has to be a continuous bleed, natural gas driven pneumatic controller after August 23rd, 2011. So it's a simple question. Do you have them? Yes or no? If you do, please indicate the approximate number of those devices you have. And if you have a pneumatic controller that's greater than 6 standard cubic feet per hour that you have to use based on functional needs or response time or safety or any of those issues, then you need to indicate that to us as well. And you need to indicate how many of those pneumatic controllers that you have. Now I'm going to talk about air pollution control devices or emission reduction devices that would be associated with your operation. And it could apply to storage vessels, it could apply to truck loading, it could apply to like DHI. So you need to complete this form for any flare, vapor combustor, thermal oxidizer, condenser, absorption system, vapor recovery unit, VTEX eliminator, or reboiler that you may have at your facility. And so at this point is when I'm going to get into detail about the different control devices or emission reduction devices that are covered under this general permit that I talked about earlier. So we'll go through the details of that now so you can see the various options that this general permit affords. Another thing about this general permit is it's been designed to allow for the use of an alternative air pollution control device if you tell us about it up front. Like sometimes maybe you'll start out with one air pollution control device or emission reduction device and then transition into another. Well, currently, if you do something like that, you're looking at a modification. And a lot of times, companies can plan for that. Either they know that's going to happen or they know historically it's happened at their other facilities. So they know that we may go from this to that. And so we ask the question in there, or, is this something that you're planning on doing? If so, and you have to complete the forms for each. And if you do that up front and indicate that to us and we permitted under the registration that's issued, then that will be allowable. But we have to know about it, from the beginning. If you don't tell us you're going to plan for an alternative control device, and then, we're going to change control devices, well then you'll have to modify your permit because your permit says that you have some other control device. So, page 28 of the application is where the air pollution control device data sheets and emission reduction device data sheets begin. Like I said, you have to fill these forms out for all the devices that I just listed prior to. And it also, at this point in time, it asks you, do you want to be approved for an alternative? And so there's your chance, yes or no. And if you answer no, then if you change control devices later on, then that's a modification. So if you answer yes, you have to indicate for which emission unit that you're wanting the alternative for. And so that's, you need to include information on the primary air pollution control device or emission reduction device and the secondary one. And there's also notification requirements in the permit for this scenario. So if you are if you're permitted for a alternative and you change that, there are notification requirements. It says in section 855 that you have to notify us of the change. And you also must conduct your emission calculations with the most conservative. So like if using one air pollution control device, your VOC emissions were 5 tons per year and the other one was 8, then your PTE has to be calculated on the 8, your facility-wide PTE would be calculated on the 8 tons per year. So that way, you know, that's worst case scenario. So that's how your PTE would be calculated. So if you are registering an alternative air pollution control device, you do need to fill out those lines at the bottom of that. It'll ask for the emission unit ID, the primary control device ID number, what it is, what the control efficiency is. You need to complete the air pollution control device or emission reduction device data sheet included. And you need to do the same thing for the secondary air pollution or emission reduction device. And I know we're getting ready to go to a break. This would be a good stopping point for it if that's possible. Okay, so we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then when we come back, we will begin going into more detail on the air pollution and emission reduction devices, and we'll reconvene at 2:30. Okay, so 2:30 we'll start back. Thanks. Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone back from the break. And like I said before we went to break, we're going to start reviewing the air pollution control device and emission reduction device sheets associated with this permit. The first sheet we're going to talk about, or first air pollution control device we're going to talk about, is vapor combustion. And this is going to include your enclosed combustors as well. And so as for basic information on the control device, such as capacity, heat input, you guys having trouble hearing me?
Your wireless there.
Is there a button? Is this better? No.
Not better.
Can you hear me in the back? Okay. All right. So, as far as like vapor combustions, like what type of control device is it? Is it enclosed combustion, a thermal oxidation, an elevated flare, completion combustion device, or a ground flare? And you need to pick the appropriate device that it is and mark the box. And then you need to indicate which emission units that this particular control device controls, and indicate that on the form, and includes the emission unit ID number and emission source description. If it controls more than 6 different devices, because there's only room to list 6 devices there, so emission units. So if it controls more than 6 different emission units, you need to increase the size of that in order to accommodate all emission units. And then ask basic questions that we would ask on a control device like this. The type of assist type it is, if it's a flare, what the height of it is, what the tip diameter is. Is it a flare whose design criteria meets that of 6018? If so, you need to provide the determination that it does. You also need to include data on the waste gas and pilot gas as well. Then you need to indicate, we'll ask questions if it's equipped to monitor the presence of a flame, what type is being used, is it thermocouple or equivalent, and you have different options there. If one of your options is not listed, please indicate it by putting it in the other column. You need to indicate the pollutants that are controlled by your control device and what control efficiency that they're controlled at. And you need to provide manufacturer's data, if available, to support these values. Like I said earlier, in the fact sheet that will accompany the G80 permit and in the permit itself, it indicates the variable control device efficiencies, destruction efficiencies that you can take depending upon the air pollution or emission reduction device that you are utilizing. The next device that we're going to talk about is a condenser. 6 years ago, when we developed G30 and G30 was a modification, but when we developed the G35, there was talk during the development process about a condenser. And we were told by industry that no one uses a condenser. So we did not include it in the G35 general permit. But we found out that people do use condensers. And so it creates an issue if you were getting a permit under G35 and using a condenser to control emissions when it didn't provide you an avenue to do so. And so a lot of people were left, the only option they were left with was doing utilizing the Rule 13 process in order to be able to claim that reduction in efficiency. So this time, we have proposed to include that here, so you have that capability that you can utilize a condenser to take credit for emission reduction. And so we've asked a series of questions about condenser operation, asking questions about temperature, inlet and outlet, coolant and gas inlet and outlet temperatures, what the control efficiency is, what the manufacturer's required range is for that condenser to operate appropriately. You need to indicate, once again, the pollutants that the condenser controls and what those control efficiencies are, and provide the manufacturer's data that will support those values. And then we ask for things like what happens if the condenser is not working appropriately, what measures are taken to ensure that the emissions are being captured appropriately. You include information from the manufacturer on maintenance if there are any, and once again, is this condenser routed to a secondary air pollution control device? And that would go back to, are you going to ask for an alternative? So if you would, then you would need to indicate, yes, when this condenser is not being used, we're doing X, and you need to indicate what that would be. Other thing to talk about is an absorption system. We don't see very many of these, but there are a few out there. The places that we've seen these utilized are on truck loadouts. And, the only time we've done this is through a Rule 13 process because there's no general permit process that would accommodate this. So we're just asking about the design parameters of the absorption system. What do you do when the media has ran its useful life? The requirement of keeping backup media there so that you don't run out, because if you're not going to have media, then you have to shut down whatever system that is that's controlling. So if you were controlling your truck loadout with a carbon absorption system, and carbon absorption system had ran its useful life and you didn't have any backup media, then you would just have to stop loading until you got yourself back into compliance with your permit. And there's language in the permit about saturation indicators and things of that nature. Once again, you need to indicate the pollutants that's controlled and the control efficiency associated with that. Now for vapor recovery units, similar to the flare, we're asking you to indicate all of the emission units that the vapor recovery unit services, and you need to include the emission unit ID of each and emission description. You need to include the pollutants that are controlled and the control efficiency associated with it. And if you remember, the control efficiency associated with a vapor recovery unit by default is 95%. If you choose to be above 95%, then if you look at the bottom of this form, you will see the 4 options that you have to increase your efficiency by 1%. So, if you install additional sensing equipment to monitor the run status of the vapor recovery unit, then you can claim 96%. I'm not going to each time talk about the percentage. You could do any of these things. I mean, for each one you do, it would increase by 1%. Or choose to do none and get 95. The other thing is to install a bypass system which operates automatically, whereby discharge is rerouted back to the inlet of the vapor recovery unit until the appropriate pressure is built up for the compressor to turn on. You can install blanket gas and have automatic throttling valves to ensure the oxygen does not enter the tanks. Or you can install a compressor that has ability to vary the drive. And once again, for each one of these that you do, you can increase your control efficiency of your vapor recovery unit by 1%. If you choose any or all of these things, it will be indicated on your issued registration. So that way you're aware of what you're required to do. Our enforcement staff is aware when they come out to inspect your facility that you need to prove that these things are being done. I think it's a perfect time to point out too that when we develop these forms, we try to develop the forms that you fill out and the forms that will be utilized in registration and the forms that will be utilized in the individual engineering evaluations that permit engineers will write during the review process of your applications are very similar. So it'll reduce the amount of time of recreation of this data. So we try to make it user-friendly for all parties. And it also, I work with Robert and his enforcement staff to make sure that they had a chance to review it. The majority of his people who do the natural gas inspections, so that when they go out and inspect these facilities, that they have the information they need at their fingertips and they don't have to go back and try to recreate things out of the application. That they have it right there, the people in permitting who reviewed it and issued the registration, that they can take that to the field and be confident in performing their inspection and it being done in a timely manner. Because we didn't want something that was just going to work for permitting or work for enforcement. We try to work together so that we got a document that everyone could be happy with. We talk about closed vent system. If you have a closed vent system, you need to provide a description of what the closed vent system is and any bypass situations you may have. Talk about your LDAR method and the frequency in which you plan to do that, and the pollutants that are controlled by that closed vent system, and what the guaranteed efficiency is for it. And then finally, a recycled reboiler stream. So if you were going to recycle the glycol dehydration unit steel vent back to the flame zone of the reboiler, what kind of control efficiency do you get for that? And there's language in the permit that if you do these things, and it's no different than what you guys have seen before, that you can claim a reduction efficiency for that for 50%. And so we ask questions about, are you doing that? And then we ask you, what happens if the temperature controller shuts off the fuel? And we ask those questions, and we're asking for you to provide information on the pollutants and the efficiencies. However, if you do have information like manufacturer's data or testing data that's reputable, that indicates that your reduction is greater than 50%, submit that information with your application so that it can be verified, and that we're not against granting a reduction of that greater than 50%, but if you want more than 50%, justification has to be provided. Okay, so that goes through all the forms, emission unit forms, and air pollution control and emission reduction forms asking for technical data. Now we're going to get into emissions calculations. With the emission calculations, as always, you guys are required to include detailed PTE for all the criteria and hazardous air pollutants for each emission point at your facility. If you have the hazardous air pollutants need to be speciated. Like in this particular situation, you look at your BTEX, hexane, xylene, xylene, BTEX, hexane. Good. I mean, we don't need you to tell us that you have an odd HAP at 1/1,000,000th of a pound per hour. I mean, we want the total HAPs, and we want you to speciate out like the BTEX and the hexane, and we'll go down to that level. The emission calculations need to include all the emission sources and the fugitive emissions at the facility and the methods that you utilized in performing those calculations. You need to make sure that the ID numbers match up with what was in attachment I, which is the emission units table. So like if engine 1 you indicate as EN1, on the form for the calculations you need to put EN1 so it's clear that that they match up. We'll get to the emission summary sheets in a second, but the emission summary sheets must be included. You need to include any modeling that was used with your calculations, whether it be like tank software, flashing emission software, GlyCalc, any of those things that were utilized in calculating your emissions. Those need to be sent in. You need to include your manufacturer's data on your engines, on your catalysts, things of that nature. If you have a certified engine, you need to include your US EPA certificate of conformity. You need to include the gas sample data so that it matches up with what was used for your flashing your flashing software, or for your DHI or your GlyCalc calculations. Any data, any test, any sampling that was used in any of those calculations needs to be included so that we can verify that it matches. And any other information that you see fit that you believe would help explain or support any calculation that were done needs to be included as well. Now for the facility-wide emission summary sheets, we have 5 different forms that we ask that you complete. I did not provide a copy of all 5 on the spreadsheet or on the PowerPoint, but they are in your application package. We're asking for regulated pollutant, controlled and uncontrolled, HAPs, controlled and uncontrolled, and a facility-wide aggregate. And those forms can be found on pages 35 through 38 of your application package, where you will list each emission point and what the emission values are for controlled and uncontrolled. And then attachment T, which is on page 39, summarizes all of that into a facility-wide aggregate summary sheet. So here's where everything should be listed. Your emission points, your fugitives, everything needs to be listed on this sheet here. Now, with the general permit, we will publish our notices next week to indicate that we plan to issue this permit. Once it's issued, it's issued. Then you go to apply for it. You guys have to place a Class 1 legal advertisement notifying the public of your notice of application. There is a legal advertisement example on page 41 of the application. The ad must appear for a minimum of 1 day in a newspaper most commonly read in the area. There is a list of qualified newspapers in the application. Once you get the affidavit of publication from the newspaper, you need to forward that to our office. So when you submit your application to us, you won't have that. I mean, like, if you're going to submit your application on Monday, then you should plan to have your ad run a paper on Monday. I mean, as close as you can. And then submit your application. Once you get the affidavit back, in the meantime, you'll be notified by us that we received your application and who it was assigned to. So once you get your affidavit of publication back, you will need to send that affidavit of publication to the person in the letter that the application was assigned to. So if the application was assigned to Roy Keys, then send the notice of public notice to Roy Keys when you get it. We realize that you guys will not have the affidavit of publication when you submit your application. So what happens is we get your application, and then you'll get a letter back from us. It's like a 48-hour letter that like you'll get back, and it says, we received your application. It was assigned to whomever. And then there'll be like a basic checklist, like if it, not like on a technical level, but just like an administrative level, it'll say your calculations weren't submitted or you didn't include this or that. But it'll always say you didn't include your legal ad. It's a reminder to you that when you get your affidavit, send it in. So you'll send it to the person in that letter. So when you place your legal ad, one of the things you have to do is you have to indicate the location of your facility. And you need to be as specific as possible. Preferably, we like to see the street address of the source, but we understand a lot of these places don't have street addresses. So, you need to indicate the nearest street or road. You also need to indicate the nearest town or unincorporated area and a county. And you have to include the latitude and longitude coordinates. If you do not include the latitude and longitude coordinates, we will make you republish your legal ad. No questions asked. I mean, no excuses. The latitude and longitude must be published in a legal ad, or it'll be required to be republished. Another common, you also need to include the type and amount of the pollutants that were discharged. And you didn't include fugitives. If you're applying for a construction, like if this is a new source, you need to say, here are the potential emissions from our source, and you need to indicate that in your legal ad, which you will see right there, where it says, the applicant estimates, ignore that, potential to discharge the following regular pollutants. And you didn't include the pollutants and the associated amounts. So you include NOx, CO, VOC, SO2, PM, HAPs like BTEX, and then total HAPs. Include that right there if it's new. If it's a modification, then what you say is the applicant estimates the increased potential to discharge the following regular air pollutants will be. And you need to include those. Just include the increase. If you're decreasing emissions, indicate that like NOx will increase by 5 tons per year and CO is going to decrease by 3 tons a year. I don't really know how that's possible, but if that's, you could have situations where some of the pollutants do decrease and some increase if it's a modification. So you need to indicate that. If you submit a modification application and you indicate your total emissions, we will ask you to republish a legal ad indicating it's a modification and only what the changes are. So you need to be sure that when you run your legal ad, if it's a modification, only indicate the changes. Don't indicate the totals. And so what you would do is say, notice is given that, Chesapeake as applied to the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, blah, blah, blah. And you would put for a G80, if it's new, general permit registration. If it's a modification, general permit modification. If it's administrative update, general permit class 2 administrative update. 4A, and you're either going to be a production, compressor, or dehy facility. You pick one of those. Located on, if there's no street address, it would be like located on the corner of Smith and Jones Street, Route 42, Charleston, Kanawha County. And then you would indicate what your latitude and longitude is. So, in regard to the application, if the application is administratively incomplete, meaning you didn't fill out any of the data sheets or you didn't fill out any of the engines and you have engines, not getting down to like, I'm not talking about like if you calculated your emissions and you said, you had an engine and like you left off 1/2 or something. At that point in time, that's going to be done during a technical review of the engineer. But I'm talking about like when the application comes in and it's looked at a high level, if you didn't include data sheets and you had engines, or you didn't include control device sheets and you had control devices, if we determine that it's administratively incomplete, or if it wasn't signed by the appropriate, like if the environmental engineer signed it and not the responsible official, or it wasn't signed at all, then the application would be returned. And we do that now anyway, but I just want to bring that point up. Another thing is, we developed these forms with the thought that because the application forms and because the registration forms and the engineering evaluation forms that have been developed to be utilized internally are very similar, if not identical, we've done this to speed the process up, the review time, as far as like the information we ask for you, we need. And the information that will be reviewed by us, so it'll be put in the form, it'll be a consistent process. It'll be easier we train internal people on how to do it. It'll be easier for the applications to be reviewed because we don't have someone who uses some 1998 air quality forms, one of the old 4-pagers on an engine, versus what we have now, which is a 1-pager. So the forms that have to be used are the ones here. You can't use any of the old forms for this. So if you use application forms, anything other than this G80, then it will be returned. We're not going to accept any substitution of forms. I mean, if you've developed your own spreadsheets or whatever, we're not taking those. It won't be accepted. These are the forms that have to be used so the process can run smoothly. Okay, that concludes the presentation on the general permit registration application. I will be doing a presentation on the general permit registration itself, but I'd be more than happy right now before we start that. If anyone has any questions about the application, I will try to answer them. If not, we will get back. If I don't have the answer now, we can get back to you. Yes, Leonard?
I would like to suggest, before you start passing this around for use, that you put an effective date at the bottom of each page, each attachment, as well as the application itself, so that at any point in time, you will already know that you have the most current issue if you prepare the date or what you have in your files versus what's on the website.
That's a good idea. For those in the live feed that may not have heard that, the suggestion was for the application forms to include the effective date of the form at the bottom of the page so that companies and or consultants would know that they were utilizing the most recent version of the form in case the forms change over time. Thank you. Any other, yeah, Rick?
Excuse me. I've got a question on the attachment U page, which is the first page of legal advertisement instructions, where you list the types and amounts of pollutants.
Okay.
I note on there that you have PM and PM10, but on the emission summary forms, it's PM10 and PM2.5. Do you want in the legal ad total PM and PM10, or should it be or PM10 and PM2.5, or should it be all three?
Okay. Let me look at that, and then one thing that might be helpful is on the actual air quality permit notice that we have, we just list the pollutants that it is that we're looking for, so that way there's no confusion. I think that might be best. The question was, okay.
And then I have a related question. Also on the summary forms, we have CO2e listed, and in the list of pollutants to go in the legal ad, I don't see CO2e or CO2 and methane separately. And so are you wanting the greenhouse gases in the legal ad?
Like I said, we'll list the pollutants on the form that we will put on our website for the people to use. So that's a good idea that those pollutants need to be listed. So that way there's no confusion. We can't say you didn't list this and make someone republish. That's a good idea. I have no problem with listing those pollutants there, so that way everyone knows exactly what it is that they need to do. No guessing. Okay. And if you wouldn't mind, Rick, if you could just put, I know you'll probably have other comments maybe, if you could just put those, same thing with you, Leonard, if you don't mind, sending that to me to that, or to that DEP G80 email address, your comments, so that way it can be part of the public record, please. Thank you. And anyone else, like I said, anyone else who has comments, whether they be about the permit or the forms or any documents that you'll see on our website tomorrow, please send those comments to the email address, or you can mail them in if you like as well. Jesse?
Would I distinguish between whether it's a production facility, compressor facility, or dehydration? What if they have one of each, or all of the above?
If you have more than one, you would need to check whatever you have. I mean, if you just have one, check one. If you have all three, then you need to check all three.
So like even in the legal ad, you just mention all three? Because it looks like
I understand what you're saying. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that's another thing too we could look at and possibly change. There was some internal debate on what we were going to call this general permit. So, you know, yeah. I mean, we can. Yeah.
Seems like just listed out in the legal ad as well if you had all.
We can address that. Just send that to me in a comment, please.
Okay. One other one, when you were talking about speciating HAPs out for like loading emissions, I know sometimes, like say if you're not using Promax, but the AP42 calculation methods that are primarily based on vapor pressure, you may not have all that speciation data. And so it seems that if AP42 is an allowable calculation method,
If you're utilizing AP42, and AP42 is acceptable for the tanker truck loading, and if it does not have the ability to do that, then you would need to include what it is that you have, because we will accept AP42 for the tank truck loading. So if it doesn't have the speciated HAPs, you would still need to include total HAPs for sure.
I think it's just VOC specific,
Um,
because it looks at all runs off the vapor pressure. Of,
I don't have a copy in front of me.
Okay.
What, I mean, but
I'll
that's fine.
double check.
Okay. Rick?
On the payment method, where you guys are going to electronic funds methods, either a transfer, electronic fund transfer, or credit card, if somebody checks one of those, will they get a follow-up, either email or call, or,
Not from me.
yeah, but state finance
But we,
department?
when an application comes in, it'll go on Bev's desk, and if you indicate that you are going to do electronic transfer or credit card, then she will either get with Jennifer or whomever, and they will make the appropriate provisions to accommodate that. Yes. Janelle?
What if, I mean, it's really cool that there's alternative control devices, but what if we decide, I mean, we're permitting something uncontrolled, and as an alternative for safety, just in case we figure out when we're operating that we want to put something, a control device on, can we actually go from, like, our main is non-controlled and our alternative is controlled? Instead of having two separate control devices?
I don't know that was something that we had anticipated with the alternative control device. We had looked at that differently, as if like you had a control device and then you were going to transition into a different control device. However, if you were uncontrolled and you want to have the ability to go to a control device, your emissions would still need to be calculated on the uncontrolled, like your PTE would still need to be calculated on the uncontrolled scenario.
Yeah, and a lot of times us putting on devices like this may not be so much an environmental thing as a safety thing. And so that flexibility for safety and making sure that we have the safest sites possible, I think, is something that would be really valuable.
One thing, like if you were uncontrolled and say you were going to go to, give me an example.
An uncontrolled tank that we might decide we want to put a combustor on just to make sure that we don't have any ignition problems.
I would have to look at that. We'd have to talk and decide how we're going to approach it. My initial feeling is, obviously, if you're going to say it was alternative, we would if we would allow that, we would indicate that you have this ability for safety purposes, and that while it's being operated, you're subject to the requirements in the permit. However, your potential emissions for the facility would still need to be calculated on an uncontrolled basis. You wouldn't be able to take credit for the emission reduction associated with it, since it was just something that was going to be alternative. Once again, it would be like if it was two control devices and your alternative, the potential for the facility has to be on the most conservative. So.
And in most cases, we would be totally fine with that. We're just the extra flexibility for safety is important.
I just need to think that through all the way, but my initial feeling is I don't see that to be an issue, as long as you understand that when the registration is issued, when you have to make the appropriate notification requirements that's in Section 8, and you're subject to the standards for that particular air pollution control device that you're going to use as an alternative. Okay.
Just in addition to what she said, you would have to also add the combustion emissions from the other alternative, so that the total PTE, you haven't gone over that.
Right.
Well, I mean, in this case, like, if we added something that didn't have extra emissions, then, we really wouldn't have to permit it, per se, because it would be a reduction, wouldn't it? So.
Well, if you're a combustion device, it's subject to Rule 6, so you'd have to permit that.
Well, I'm saying, like, if we had a D-high and we just decided we wanted to use a condenser, that wouldn't really trigger a permit.
If you permitted it uncontrolled to begin with.
Yeah.
Right.
So the benefit would be on these combustion devices that would have to be permitted.
Correct. Any other questions? Okay. We're going to move on to the registration document itself. So, the application comes in, application is reviewed, and it's determined that all the rules are met. But all the eligibility requirements are met, all the rules are met, then we would say, okay, we're going to issue a registration. So I want to go through the document that will be used for that. So this is page 1 of the registration. We'd say it's a Class 2 general permit G80 registration, and it would either be like construct or modify or like an administrative update. And we would fill in the registration number. And everyone knows how the registrations go. It's G80-001, 002. If you modify it, it goes A, B, C, D, so forth and so on. We'd indicate the company name, facility ID, and a facility, or the facility name and a facility ID. And then ask Fred to sign it, and then indicate what the date of issuance is. So on page 2, if this registration would supersede and replace any other registration, whether it be a Rule 13 permit or a G30, 35, or 70, or if we had any type of consent orders that may be associated with the facility and the consent order indicated that you had to get some kind of permit, all that information would be included there. We just put down basic information about where the facility is located, its mailing address, its physical address, what type of facility it was, the NAICS and SIC codes, latitude and longitude, the directions, what type of registration it was, and what was going, like if it was new, indicate what kind of facility it was. If it was a modification, indicate the change or the modification. And since all these facilities are minor sources and none of them are required by any of the NSPSs to get a Part 70 permit, they're all not subject to Rule 30, so they'd be subject to Rule 22, and you had to pay the applicable fee annually that we went over earlier this morning. On page 3, this is where we would look at the information that you submitted with your application. We would review it and either agree with the way that you guys completed a sheet, or maybe in the process there was some back and forth and trying to figure out maybe some of these things changed. But this is us. This is the DP telling the company, these are the sections that apply to you. So, say you have a gas well. We say you're subject to Section 5. As you can see, it says see Section 5. So that'll reference you to go to Section 5 of the permit and see what those requirements are. Section 5, in this particular situation, though, is incorporated by reference. So you would need to consult the CFR specifically for what's going on. But we would indicate what the API number of the well is, the farm name, whether or not it's green completion and combustion device, and the date that the well was completed. Some of these things aren't going to apply in every particular situation. I mean, if you got a compressor station, no wells, and you're not going to have anything in that table. And I mean, Section 5 is not going to be checked in the applicability table. So you can just bypass that. As far as storage vessels go, we're going to indicate the emission unit ID number, the emission point, the content, and here again is where we will list the oil tank, lube oil tanks, used oil tanks. We will put them in this table. We will put the size, the gallon, or the volume. All those have to be listed, so there's no questions, like when enforcement staff goes out, that like you guys weren't allowed to have those things at your facility. And we'll indicate here what control devices you may have. Do you have a VRU? Are you subject to Quad O? And the G80 section. So are you just subject to Section 6? Are you subject to 6 and 8? Are you subject to 7? And all that will be indicated here. So you'll get this and you'll be like, okay, this tank is subject to Section 6 and Section 8. Or if it's a Quad O tank, it's subject to Section 7. For fuel burning units, we'll indicate the maximum design heat input of the fuel burning unit. And then in reality, I could probably delete the last column. It says G80 applicable sections, because all that's going to be, well, I'll take that back, because the reboilers will be subject to 15. So actually we need to leave that there. That must have been why I did it in the first place. So it's either going to be 9 or 15. If it's a GPU or heater treater or inline heater, it's going to be Section 9. If it's a reboiler, it's going to be Section 15. And do you have any pneumatics? Yes or no, and the approximate count of the pneumatics that you have at your facility. For the centrifugal and reciprocating compressors, do you have any of these that are effective facilities that aren't located at the well site? And if you do, we will indicate the description of those on this table. And once again, you go back to the permit and it'll indicate what it is exactly it is you have to do for these units. The next sheet deals with the internal combustion engines, where we'll indicate your make and model, any control device, when it was installed, when it was manufactured. When it says subject to 13.14 or 13.21, what that references are like catalytic reduction device requirements. So if you look at those sections, depending upon whether you're rich or lean burn and what type of catalyst you have, it'll indicate what it is you have to do to show compliance with those values. We also ask that you indicate the engine type, and or not, we do this stuff, I'll take that back, it's not we ask you. We'll indicate the engine type, we'll indicate the applicable rules. So if it's a 4J engine, we'll say, you know, it's 4J engine. Is it certified? Is it in that window? And we'll also indicate whether it's a new or existing engine under 4Z. The following page was developed with input from enforcement as far as testing requirements for 4J. You know, this is so you guys. Not that you don't already know this, because I know that compliance plans are developed and you know that you have to test these engines, but it's just a reminder is that this is, you know, this particular engine you got to do an initial performance test, or you have to do every 876 or 3 years, whichever comes first. It's also a reminder to enforcement staff that when they go out and they check these records, that they know they can go back and look at the last time these engines were tested and whether or not the requirements are being met. For the tanker truck loadout, have throughput limits, any type of control device that you're going to be utilizing, and whether or not it's got a closed system, and what the collection efficiency is that you are claiming. For the DHI units, are you subject to double H? Do you meet one of the double H exemptions? What's the max flow rate? And indicate what air pollution control device or emission reduction devices that are associated with the particular DHI unit. The next page deals with the air pollution and emission reduction devices, where we'll list those, or we'll list the control efficiencies associated with them, what it's controlling, what the capacity of it is, you know, what section is, you know, is subject to, and we'll indicate that for both of those. And then the final thing in the registration document will be any emission limitations that are set on these units. Like for engines, you know, we'll go in and we'll set limits on NOx, CO, VOC, and formaldehyde. You know, for dehives, we're going to look at VOCs and your BTECs. Storage vessels. When I say storage vessels, we're talking about like condensate tanks, produced fluids tanks, where we'll go in and these are all case by case. I mean, we need to look at these individually. I can't sit here and tell you that you're going to see this in all instances. I mean, we're going to have to use, you know, our judgment when we set these emission limits and how we do that. But this is provided here for as an example, so you can see, you know, the thought process behind it. Same thing with truck loading or any control devices you may have, as far as flares or closed combustion devices. Are we going to set emission limits on those, and what will those emission limits be? We really believe that developing this document and bringing all these permits together into one is something that we believe is beneficial for all parties through being consistent, you know, promoting consistency amongst all facilities, allowing the use of control efficiencies that wouldn't be achieved through regulations. So that's a benefit to the environment, that the emissions could actually be lower than what they would be otherwise if it was just set at the regulation limit. Allowing facilities flexibility to utilize those alternatives. So in hopes that modifications and administrative updates to permits decrease. We have enough work to do, and so do you guys. So having to apply for, you know, administrative updates and modifications on a regular basis hinders everyone. So we believe that this permit should alleviate it. We also believe that with the similarity between the application forms and the registration and the engineering evaluation should help with the review time, and also help with the enforcement side of it as well. Once again, I thank everybody for coming in attendance, and also to those on the live stream. And I'll take more questions right now if anyone has any. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, I want to finish up by saying that any comments that you have, please send those to that DEP-G80-A@w.gov email address, or send it in the mail. And the legal ads will be published in those newspapers that we talked about earlier next week. We will have a public meeting about this permitting action on March 16th from 6 p.m. until 8 p.m. in this same room. And the public comment period for this permitting action ends on March 30th at 5 p.m. So if no one has any other questions, thanks again for attending.